Good evening to you all. You are warmly welcome to Lecture 5 on the topic Research Ethics. Before the session ends, these are the objectives we would like to achieve. 1. Discuss the historical background that led to the creation of various codes of ethics. 2. Identify and discuss the three broad ethical principles articulated in the Belmont Report on research ethics. And then 3. Identify the 8 primary ethical principles articulated in the Tri-Council policy statement on research ethics and identify procedures for adhering to them. Now, the question is, what is research ethics? Before I explain, let's look at the term ethics. Ethics simply refer to moral principles that govern an activity or that govern an institution. So all professions have their own code of ethics, and research is of no exception. Therefore, in conducting a research, you need to follow some ethics so that you don't violate the right of your participants. So research ethics simply refers to a diverse set of values, norms, and institutional regulations that help constitute and regulate scientific research. It mostly pertains to research demands versus participants' rights. So the issue is, when humans are used as study participants, care must be exercised to ensure that their rights are protected. Before I proceed, let me give you historical background of studies which actually violated ethical conduct. And I've sampled 4 of them here. We have the Nazi medical experiment, the Tuskegee syphilis study, the Jewish chronic disease hospital study, and Herbert Green cervical cancer study. First of all, the Nazi medical experiment actually occurred in the 1930s and 1940s, and they are a famous example of disregard for ethical conduct. The Nazi program of research involved the use of prisoners of war and racial enemies in numerous experiments designed to test the limit of human endurance and human reaction to diseases and untested drugs. The studies were unethical because 1. The subjects were exposed to permanent physical harm, and 2. Some were also exposed to death. And then the third issue was that subjects were forced and they could not refuse participation. 2. Between 1932 and 1972, the Tuskegee syphilis study was also conducted, and this study was sponsored by the US Public Health Service. In this study, investigation on the effect of syphilis was actually done among 400 men from a poor African American community. This study too was unethical because medical treatment was deliberately withheld to study the cause of the untreated disease. Then in the 1960s, live cancer cells were injected into elderly patients at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn in the 1960s. This was also unethical because the consent of the patient were not sought. Then the fourth one, Dr. Herbert Green of the National Women's Hospital in Auckland, New Zealand, studied women with cervical cancer in the 1980s. And patients with carcinoma were not given treatment so that researchers could study the natural progress of the disease. So, in response to some of these ethical violations, several codes of ethics have been developed, and the first among them was the Nuremberg Code in 1949. This code was actually formulated in direct response to the Nazi medical experiment. Now, the code was actually protecting study participants, and the code focuses on voluntary informed consent, that the participant should voluntarily give their consent to take part in the study or decline from the study without being coerced by the researcher. Then the participants have the liberty of withdrawal from the study at any point in time. Also, the participants have the right of protection from physical and mental harm, suffering, and then death. Then in 1964, there was a Declaration of Helsinki, which is also another code of ethics. The declaration emphasized the protection of subjects in research and strongly proclaimed that the well-being of individuals is more important than scientific and social interests. And this was mostly recently revised in 2008. Now, in 1978, another code was adopted in the US, which we called the Belmont Report. And currently, this ethical principle is being used by researchers. The Belmont Report articulated three broad principles on which standards of ethical conduct in research are based. So you have the first one, the principle of beneficence, principle of respect for human dignity, and the principle of justice. The principle of beneficence imposes a duty on researchers to minimize harm and maximize benefit. In terms of that, the principle actually covers these two areas: the right of the participants to freedom from harm and discomfort, meaning researchers have an obligation to avoid or minimize harm in studies with humans. That is, participants must not be subjected to any physical, psychological, social, and any economic harms. 2. The participants have the right to freedom from exploitation, meaning that involvement in a study should not place study participants at a disadvantage or expose them to damages. Then the second principle is talking about the principle of respect for human dignity. This also covers two areas. One, the right of the participant to self-determination. Self-determination means that prospective participants can voluntarily decide whether to take part in a study without risk of prejudicial treatment. Then also, the participants have the right to full disclosure. Full disclosure means that the researcher has fully described the nature of the study, the person's right to refuse participation, the researcher's responsibilities, and the likely risks and benefits. Then finally, the principle of justice also talk about the right to fair treatment, and then the right to privacy of the study participants. Apart from the Belmont Report, we also have another ethical principle which was established by the Tri-Council policy, and they have 8 guiding principle. One, let's talk about respect for human dignity. That is, as a researcher, when conducting research, you should have some respect for the individuals you are using for the study. So respect for human dignity. Two, they talk about respect for free and informed consent. Three, respect for vulnerable persons. Four, respect for privacy and confidentiality. Five, respect of justice and inclusiveness. Six, balancing harms and benefit. Then seven, minimizing harm, known as non-malefficiency. And then the eighth one, maximizing benefit, which we call the beneficence. So as a researcher or a student researcher, what are the procedures you are going to employ to protect study participants? One, before you conduct your study, you actually do a risk benefit assessment. Also, you make sure there is an informed consent. Informed consent means that participants have adequate information about the research, comprehend that information, and have the ability to consent to or decline participation voluntarily. The third one, you need to ensure confidentiality procedures. Participants' right to privacy is protected either through anonymity or through other confidentiality procedures. How can you protect the anonymity of your participants? So we are saying anonymity is protected when the researcher cannot link participants to their data or responses. So as a researcher, make sure you cannot link your participants to their data. That is why whenever we are developing a questionnaire, we don't ask participants to write their names. Even at times when they are even taking sample from participants for a study, we don't include their name. We rather use IDs or codes. This is a way to ensure that the anonymity of our participants are or is protected. Now, when anonymity is impossible, then we need to ensure confidentiality procedures. And what is confidentiality? Is the management of private information by the researcher in order to protect the participant's identity. Also, you can actually ensure debriefings and referrals. Debriefing sessions are offered after data collection is completed to permit participants to ask questions or air complaints. In some situations, researchers may need to assist study participants with special challenges by making referrals to appropriate health, social, or psychological services. Then, the fifth one is to make sure you treat your vulnerable groups with respect. Vulnerability is classified as characteristics of people unable to protect their own rights and welfare. And therefore, if you're using vulnerables like prisoners, those who are mentally ill, or emotionally disabled, or terminally ill, aged people, or children, you need to actually treat them fairly, or you need to respect their rights. And also, you can subject your study to research ethics board and external reviews because researchers often have a strong commitment to their research and they may not be objective in their risk benefit assessment because of the possibility of a biased self-evaluation. The ethical dimension of a study should normally be subjected to external review. Example, you can subject your study to the institutional review board. Thanks so much. These are our references. These are some sample questions that you can look at. Then you give your comment. Then whenever I'll come and respond to your comment. Thanks so much for participating.